angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology. Conspiracy, discovery, special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV. Special Investigative Report.
Almost 100 years ago, 3 children in Fatima, Portugal, claimed to have a vision of the Virgin Mary, who gave them a prophecy of things that were to come. And the third secret was about a bishop in white who climbed a hill surrounded by carnage. What is the relevance to our world today? That's our topic in this special report on the Path of the Immortals. I'm Derek Gilbert, Skywatch TV, along with the co-author of the best-selling books Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, and Exo Vaticana, and the forthcoming book on the Path of the Immortals, Tom Horn. Tom?
Great to be with you again, Derek.
We had talked about some threats made against the Pope, against Rome, by the Islamic State, and begun to discuss the relevance to the prophecies of Fatima, and also to the prophecy of the popes, which you deal with extensively in Petrus Romanus. The prophecy, and I guess we kind of use that word loosely as Protestants, and we'll talk about the weight that we give extra biblical prophecy here in this program. But the message, the third secret of Fatima and the bishop in white, what was that third secret, and how seriously does Pope Francis take this?
I think he does take it. Well, of course, you left off on the last show talking about how he, dedicated
his papacy and also consecrated the world to the what he calls what Roman Catholics call the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But he did it in front of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima, which he had brought from Portugal to Rome for this ceremony on October 13th of 2013. And of course, that statue has the bullet that struck Pope John Paul II during the assassination attempt embedded in the crown of the statue. So,
and the relevance of that, of course, is that if people understand the part of the prophecy that was published. Now, Rome claims that it published the entire third secret, but there were many scholars, actually, of the third secret of Fatima, people that actually had the opportunity to read it. We're talking about, highly placed bishops or cardinals that had access to it. That had indicated it said much more than what was promulgated in the year 2000. 1981, there's a guy that tries to assassinate John Paul II. And in the year 2000, John Paul II is the one that authorizes the release of the third secret of Fatima. Now, that secret was supposed to be released a long time ago. Lucia, or Lucy Santos, had been told by the angel or by Mary that it was to be kept a secret until around the 1960s, and then it was supposed to be published. Her bishop...
And actually, when she was asked about that, she said that it was Mary that told her to hold the first 2 secrets until, was it 1940 or 41? Right. But that it was on her own initiative. She just felt that the third secret would not be understood until sometime after 1960. So she's the one who made that decision.
Yeah, that was actually what she said. She said at that time, world developments will be such that the prophecy can be more clearly understood.
Right.
But her bishop read it, ordered it sealed, and actually Lucy, she only died a few years ago, and she was essentially kept under house arrest. She was not allowed to talk to the public about the secret whatsoever.
Right.
The Secretary of State, Tarcisio Bertoni, would go and visit her on a regular basis. There's some evidence that even threats were made that would come from her Catholic faith. In other words, you might not get out of purgatory as quick as you want to if the prayers are not being said. So
that was significant because at the time, the then Archbishop Bertoni was the head of the congregation which was responsible for enforcing or protecting official Roman Catholic doctrine.
Right.
So he was essentially the guy who made the final call on what was and what was not official Roman Catholic doctrine.
Right. And so the secret isn't released in the 60s because the powers that be determined that whatever the secret is, it's too troubling, it's too disturbing. And there were radio shows, by the way, Malachi Martin, he was a highly placed Jesuit. He worked for 3 different popes. He was a polyglot. He translated the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Holy See. A highly educated guy. And after he was relieved of his priestly duties on request of the Pope, becomes a best-selling author, and he's writing these books out there. And some of his books are, I mean, they're very maverick. They're saying things about Rome becoming the seat of the Antichrist, and about the enthronement of the archangel Lucifer at the Vatican, and all these things he's saying. And then he would be on TV and on radio. And one of the shows he was on, somebody called in one day and they asked him about the third secret of Fatima, and they said they had heard that the third secret had to do with Rome becoming apostate and becoming the seat of the Antichrist. And Malachi, and you can still listen to the audio file, he says, yes, it sounds like they have read the third secret of Fatima, which he had access to. Well, that's contradictory to what was published in the year 2000 when John Paul says we're going to release the third secret, and it describes the bishop in white. A bishop in white, he's walking through a city that is, sounds like it's been bombed or it's been hit by a meteorite or something has happened because the city is just in ruins, half in ruins.
Corpses everywhere.
Corpses everywhere, people dying everywhere. He's walking along praying for the people as they're dying, and he's trying to make his way to a cross. And at that time, ISIS-like fighters run into the city and they shoot him, right? And they kill him. So in 2000, you had Cardinal Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict. He was part of the committee. Sodano, Tarcisio Bertoni, right. They're all part of the committee working under Pope John Paul II. And they say they're going to release the third secret. Well, when they release the third secret, all they give is that description of the city and the bishop in white, and they say this was fulfilled in 1981 with the assassination attempt against John Paul.
But Our Lady guided the bullet and preserved him and stopped him at the threshold of death. And that's why they put the bullet in the statue of Our Lady of Fatima and the crown of Our Lady of Fatima. Yeah.
And so you had Catholic scholars, you had the Washington Times, you had the New York Times. They're all running articles saying, excuse me, first of all, he wasn't walking through a city half destroyed. He was riding the Pope Mobile. He wasn't killed like the vision says that he was. And there were no other dead people. Nobody else was shot. So it didn't match even the part of the vision that they released. Now, but is that vision something that the current Pope believes could be fulfilled by the Islamic nation? See, that's what I think. That's why I think that you hear Francis right now saying, I am willing to be assassinated if that is God's will. I just hope it doesn't hurt, because I think he's a believer. Furthermore, I think he's a believer in the prophecy of the popes, which also, that final line describes how that during this pope's time on the throne of Peter, the city of Rome is destroyed, and presumably him along with it, right? So it seems to match the Fatima prophecy. And I think he's a believer in that prophecy. I think he thinks at this time he's playing his role as the final pope. Here's the thing to keep in mind about Pope Francis is he carries himself as a very humble man. And he might be a humble man, but he's not an ignorant man. He's a Jesuit. He's got advanced degrees in science, in history. He's fully aware that he is the final line in a 900-year-old Catholic prophecy that has meant a lot to a lot of cardinals down through time. Popes have even gone out of their way at times to show that they were the fulfillment of their line in the prophecy of the popes. Even documentaries made to show that I'm the one that was in the prophecy of the popes. So they do pay a lot of attention to it. And as a Jesuit, he's following a mystical path, a prophetic path, and so I think he believes in it.
Now, the Jesuit order has come under some criticism. Malachi Martin, who was a Jesuit, was maybe one of the few, maybe the only, as far as I know, ex-Jesuit relieved of his priestly duties. The Jesuit order throughout history has been evicted from a number of countries around the world, including some countries that are officially Roman Catholic, like Spain. What is it that the Jesuits are about that the governments find so offensive? I mean, are they engaged in more than just religious education?
Well, absolutely. Of course, a lot of universities that were built by the Jesuits, the purpose was to form an anti-Reformation movement, right? When the Reformation was growing and the Catholic Church was losing lots and lots of people to what we today would call evangelical Christianity, the Jesuits were actually formed to become an arm of the Vatican to turn that turn that curve back around, to bring people back under the fold. They were an anti-Reformation, but it included universities, intellectualisms. They would slowly, if you can control the mind and the thinking and the philosophy of the world at large, then you can control everything else. Malachi Martin also said in his book, The Jesuits, that they wanted to control the Vatican in particular. Mm-hmm. And he said there was a secret war going on between the Jesuits and the other priests. And he says that if ever the Jesuits were to take control of the Vatican, well, essentially that would be the end. That's when it becomes just a machine, he says, of the New World Order, an arm of the Antichrist. And he must be rolling over in his grave today, or he must be rolling over in purgatory, to know that the very first Jesuit pope in history just took the throne. So obviously the Jesuits won that war.
And just coincidentally, after the first pope in 600 years resigned.
Right.
Generally, the popes don't resign. They're essentially carried out of the Vatican.
Which is, by the way, it's interesting because this whole special investigative report, this is going to go on for we don't know how many shows, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to have Chris Putnam here in the next program. He'll do a couple of shows with us. We'll have our field investigators here, and we'll start showing video and film from the field investigations that'll ultimately lead up to us talking about what in the world is this book On the Path of the Immortals all about, right?
Well, we'll show you a little glimpse of that. We'll also talk about the Pope's geopolitical initiatives. He, as Tom mentioned, will be Pope Francis, that is, will be addressing the United States Congress. He's also released a very interesting encyclical that, again, has nothing to do with religion. We'll talk about that as our special investigative report On the Path of the Immortals continues next on Skywatch TV.
Now we're on our way to the petroglyphs. There are some strange images that are there.
Yeah. I saw it with the naked eye. Yeah. Did you see it? The orb. I saw an orb with the naked eye. What is that?
In 2012, they shocked the world when they predicted Pope Benedict's resignation 1 year in advance. In 2013, they uncovered the mysteries of Mount Graham, the Lucifer device, and the Vatican's secret plan for the arrival of an alien savior. For the last 24 months, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam have been working behind the scenes on their most guarded project and greatest discovery yet. Mount Graham in Arizona is said to be a portal, and the Jesuits admit they are monitoring something there that is approaching the Earth. But as the Vatican knows and the authors just uncovered, this mountain is not the only gateway to another dimension. Now, in their new book, On the Path of the Immortals, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam set out with cameras and field investigators to document the most astonishing evidence of those behind the veil. Armed with inside intelligence from the native peoples, they unearth chilling evidence of what the Bible says about sacred locations and the giant beings that await their time from within.
They claimed that they could actually conjure light ships down, UFOs, aliens.
So what would have caused these ancient Pueblo Anastasi Indians to have departed this area with such great haste?
We don't know why they never finished completion of the Sun Temple.
Many of them escaped right through some of these mountains, some of these old Anasazi ruins.
Travel with internationally acclaimed investigative authors of Petrus Romanus and Exo Vaticana to learn the truth behind a secret so fantastic that it took 2 years and thousands of miles of research to document what has been kept hidden from the public by elitists and intellectuals who are planning mankind's assimilation under a coming savior.
Here's the six-toed giant our Indian guide told us about. And there's the fallen reptilian with the halo above his head that came through the portal.
One whom the prophet Daniel foresaw as an alien god. On the Path of the Immortals.
Pope Francis addressing the United States Congress and issuing an encyclical that deals with how we live our everyday lives. What is this all about? Welcome back to our special investigative report on the Path of the Immortals on Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert, along with Tom Horn, co-author of the forthcoming book On the Path of the Immortals. Pope Francis, addressing climate change. What does that have to do with religion, our Christian faith, our relationship with Jesus Christ?
Well, not much, I would say, frankly, from my worldview. I think that we as Christians obviously would say that we have a responsibility to be good stewards of creation, everything that belongs to God. But the encyclical, and we haven't seen the encyclical yet. It may be out by the time this show broadcasts. It's supposed to be any day now. Originally, I think they said it'd be during March. But there are some concerns, not just among evangelicals, but also among some conservative Catholics. One is the point we already made, that it kind of joins the church to political issues,
right?
Which is a concern because, this could smack of the Antichrist system. In the book of Revelation, when it describes the rise of the Antichrist, you have a political figure. But then you also have this second beast that it talks about with two horns like a lamb, which scholars think that infers that he pretends to be a representative of Jesus Christ, right? The Lamb of God. But it says he speaks as a dragon, so the voice behind the voice, his power is Luciferian in nature. And of course, ultimately, in the same parts of the book of Revelation, it doesn't take long for that to be betrayed when he starts causing all who won't worship the image of the beast to be killed.
Right.
But
when you marry church and state, then a disagreement over theology becomes treason.
Right. With Chris Putnam and I writing The Prophecy of the Popes, which predicted the resignation of Pope Benedict 1 year in advance, even to the month. We could get into that if we need to, or maybe wait till Chris is here. But that caused the world essentially to look at that book and to start asking some of these questions. Then we wound up in Exo Vaticana. In Exo Vaticana, we mentioned something that might be connected to this encyclical. And it takes a moment to understand this. When you start talking about environmentalism, you wonder what in the world could that possibly have to do with Exo Vaticana, which is talking about life on other planets.
Right.
But along this path we've taken, we've wound up with some conservative Catholics, including a couple of priests that are willing to converse with us via email. And one of them said, watch to see if there's anything in the encyclical that connects to this idea of many worlds. And among the Catholic scholars, there are a lot of them. Benedict was one of them that believed that there could be something to this idea of many worlds, that we're one world of many. God has many more out there where our space brothers are. But among this coalition of worlds is a responsibility to nature, is a responsibility to creation. A good way for people to understand this idea is, remember the old classic film, The Day the Earth Stood Still?
Ah, yes, Klaatu, Barada Nikto.
Yeah.
Yes.
It scared the majeebies out of me when I was a kid, right?
That's what Gary Stearman started on his career path.
Right. Well, but now in that original one, the classic, which is still the best one that was ever made, the issue was nuclear armament. We were building nuclear arms, and so, the big space alien with his robot comes down here to warn us that if ever we think we're going to extend that military presence or bombs or whatever into space, we're going to become a burned out cinder, I think he says. Right. They're going to wipe us out. But that film was remade a couple of years ago, starring Keanu Reeves, and it was a very subtle change, right? He comes down, he's got the giant robot, but now the whole issue is environmentalism. And this is very much taken from some of the Catholic thought about many worlds, that the angels are watching, our space brothers are watching, God is watching, and we have a responsibility to the environment. And that's a very close step to saying we are the disease. That's essentially what the spaceman in the remake of that film says. We are the disease. And this goes, of course, into Gaiaism. Will what the Pope says in his encyclical, will it hint at this idea that the earth is a living, sentient organism?
Well, that's really interesting because the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, in a homily in 2009, praised the work of the Jesuit Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is called by some the father of the New Age movement, but also called by some the father of the Internet, because it was he who first coined, a couple of terms that we're very familiar with. One is transhuman, and the other is social network. And he believed that he believed in evolution, and he tried to reconcile that with his faith by postulating that creation is evolving, and that as it evolves and our social networks become more complex as humans, as the world around us, the biosphere, becomes more complex, that it becomes sentient, and that at some point we will all wake up, become one with the universe and the omega point. So, and Pope Benedict actually said that the role of the priesthood was to consecrate the earth into a living host, which in Roman Catholic catechism, the host is literally the body of Jesus Christ, miraculously transformed from a wafer into his body during the Mass. So there is some thought there that perhaps this influential Jesuit thinker, Teilhard, is influencing current Roman Catholic thought, and that our role on the planet is to, again, shepherd the planet to our next stage of evolution. There may be some connection there to this idea that we are to join this, I don't know, the space brotherhood and becoming one with the cosmic Christ, the omega point, as Teilhard put it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Benedict actually wrote in his own book about Chardin and praised his thinking, which tells you that at least that pope, and it's possible that this current pope, being a Jesuit, and that was what I was told to watch for. Now, since we don't have the benefit of the encyclical yet,
but that is something to watch for in 2015.
It's to watch for in 2015. That and actually, here's what I was told was that, and this is not something mysterious. Oh, Tom's referring to a mysterious informant or something like that. It's just to be watched for. That if something that might smack of astrobiology is not included in this encyclical, look for something later this year. In fact, that can be sourced to the current leader of the VORG, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, Jose Gabriel Funes, gave an interview with the Catholic media recently. Pretty soon, he said he's going to turn his attention to astrobiology. Well, when Funes says that, he would know because they're friends, and they both have an interest. Bergoglio earned degrees in chemistry and had ambitions of actually entering into science fields before he became a Jesuit. So whether it's the encyclical is going to hint at it or later this year, but it's going to take us to the second book, Exo Vaticana, and some of the shows that we'll do when Chris Putnam gets here, because it sounds like they might be preparing us for this coalition of worlds, this many worlds idea, in that maybe they think they know something. And they've been saying a lot of things over the last few years that lead you to believe that they think they know something about disclosure. And of course, again, that goes back to Malachi, 97, when Art Bell says,
right, something coming in possibly the next 10 years.
Right.
Yeah. Or at the very least, they're hedging their bets because it is believed by many that Christians would find their faith rocked if suddenly E.T. were to land on the White House lawn, which isn't necessarily the case, but that's for another program. So we'll deal with those in the forthcoming programs with Chris, the links between the scientific research, the astronomical research, and perhaps these ideas that the ties to how that would affect their positions of faith. But there was something else I wanted to touch on real quick with just a couple of minutes. Last fall, the former president of Israel, Shimon Peres, traveled to Rome and proposed to Pope Francis the idea of a United Nations of religions, with Francis perhaps developing the idea, shepherding the idea to fruition. We're looking perhaps a global unity of the major religions. What is your thoughts on that? Have your research turned up anything on that?
Francis has actually talked about it. So, he's coming to the United States. He's going to speak before a joint session of the U.S. Congress. He's going to speak before the United Nations. But then when he goes back to Rome, he's already announced, I don't know if the date is set yet, but he's announced that he's going to call all of the leaders of the world's major religions together to talk about how we can work together in better cooperation and unity. So once again, this takes you back to this second beast that rises up with two horns like a lamb, but who speaks as a dragon, and this idea that there's going to be a final global religion. It might be kind of loose, but mandatory. An encyclical, for instance, is kind of a mandatory piece of diction that comes down from the Pope. He gives his encyclical, which he's going to do any day now. It goes to all of the bishops, and then the bishops have the responsibility of passing forward that information to all 1.2 billion Catholics in the world, and it becomes a moral responsibility for them to follow whatever the encyclical is. Well, so this Pope's on a mission, and what might the next encyclical be? What might the next authoritative statement be? He's already telling us that following these things, he's going to get all of the nations, all of the leaders of the religions of the world together. I don't know if that's other than Christian. It might just be all the denominations of Christendom, and talk about how we can form global unity. One very quick thing. I know we're going to run out of time, but people have heard me talk before, too, about the Zohar 700 years ago. Now, this is the most important book of Jewish Kabbalah ever. The Orthodox Jews pay attention to it. And in the Vieira section and in the subsection, the sign heralding Mashiach, or the coming of the Messiah, it said that in the year 5773, which would have been 212 to 213, the new moon of 212 over I think, into September of 2013, says that the Messiah would begin making himself known to the Orthodox leaders in Israel, right? And then slowly from then forward start making himself known to the nations of the world. Well, if that prophecy is true, then the Messiah, whoever that person is pretending to be or is, made himself known. So now all of a sudden they're dedicating the altar for the third Jewish temple. And I even wonder, this new television series, Dig, which is implying that there's movement now about among the Orthodox priests and others, that what are they going to announce? They found the Ark of the Covenant.
And the Temple Institute is already putting out articles about the significance of the red heifer and so forth.
Right.
So we are seeing a culmination. We talked about the Muslim prophecies, especially the apocalyptic Mahdist versions of their prophecies. We're seeing Jewish prophecy, perhaps, coming together, and movement on the part of Rome that indicates that they see something coming that may signal the end times.
Well, and this Zohar, the point that I was going to make is it too sees the destruction of Rome at about that same time. So there is a whole concatenation of prophecies here coming together from the Jews to the Catholics to biblical to Islamic. All of them seem to be coming together at one time.
Yeah, and it's a lot to get your head around, but if you'd like to do it, now is the time, because we're offering, as part of our special report on the Path of the Immortals, a special package that include the first 2 books in what has become a 3-volume set. Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, Exo Vaticana, Chris Putnam and Tom Horn's first 2 books, their forthcoming book, On the Path of the Immortals, which will be released very shortly. All those 3 books together, combined with an excellent primer on the space brother meme, if you will, What Lies Beyond, the author Jeffrey Mardis. Those 4 books plus 2 DVDs, special investigative report on the Path of the Immortals, and Tom Horn's presentation at Chuck Missler's Strategic Perspectives Conference on the secret Vatican and alien Antichrist connection. All of that together, a $120 value for just $39.95. Tom, this will continue. We barely scratched the surface. For Skywatch TV, I'm Derek Gilbert.
Angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology. Conspiracy. Discovery. Special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV. Special Investigative Report.
There is a portal on a sacred mountain in the American Southwest with entities waiting for their opportunity to appear through the portal on the other side. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. At least that's what the Native Americans believe. And we'll talk to a couple of authors who you are probably aware of, internationally renowned authors of the books Exo Vaticanus and Petrus Romanus, the Final Pope is Here. Their latest investigation into a really remarkable phenomenon and belief system of the Native Americans has resulted in the forthcoming book, On the Path of the Immortals. I'm talking, of course, about Tom Horn and Chris Putnam. Gentlemen, welcome to Skywatch TV.
Hey, great to be with you again, Derek.
I'm trying to condense all this down into a couple of pithy sentences to open the program to attract the interest of the viewers, and it's difficult to do. There's a lot here, and we'll try to get through as much as we can in the course of this half hour. But first things first, what is it that led you to go back to the site of where you did much of the research for Exo Vaticana, the Mount Graham Observatory in Arizona?
Yeah, well, you know, like we were talking about before the show, the whole thing actually had a kind of preternatural feel to it from the time that Chris Putnam contacted me via email. We didn't even really know each other, asking me if he could use a quote about the Pope that I had written 3 or 4 years earlier and hadn't thought about since. And remember that, and me saying, wow, the timing is incredible, because my son and I had just been in the other room at the same time he was writing the email saying, isn't it strange that nobody has written a thorough examination of the ancient prophecy of the popes. A 900-plus-year-old prophecy is about to come to an end, and no matter what you make of it, you believe in it, you don't believe in it, whatever, it's still, right, it's got historic value. And of course, there also always seemed to be those priests, those cardinals that were putting some kind of stock in it. Even one pope who went out of his way to have a documentary produced to show that he was the fulfillment of his line in the prophecy. So we were just very curious about that. And, you know, one thing led to the other. Chris and I decided to work on that book together. And the rest, as they say, is history. It became a best-selling book. But what happened then was, as he and I were doing television, and Chris wound up in some History Channel documentaries, and the world was very intrigued with what we were talking about. But over and over, on shows where you could call in and ask questions, people would call in and say, yeah, but what do you make of the Vatican out there now talking so much about aliens and astrobiology, and their leading astronomers are out there saying, I would baptize an alien, and these would be our space brothers. And people were very intrigued with that about 24 or 36 months ago. And we knew that in order to not come across as just a couple of evangelicals, right, who might be taking cheap shots at the church's astronomers, that we really had to go to the horse's mouth, which meant, if possible, we were going to have to go to Mount Graham in Arizona, where a lot of people don't know that the Vatican has an advanced telescope.
That's right.
70 miles from Tucson in Arizona on the top of that mountain. We were going to have to go there and try to interview the Vatican's astronomers, the Jesuits, and see if we could get to the bottom of why they were suddenly talking about all this stuff.
So that produced the book Exo Vaticana, which of course followed up the Petrus Romanus book. What has the Vatican been saying, Chris, about extraterrestrials, and what are they looking for with their observatory at Mount Graham?
Yeah, really interesting. Since Exo Vaticana came out, I cataloged 4 of their astronomers who had mentioned baptizing extraterrestrials, and going back to 1992. And, you know, really kind of an interesting statement. You think maybe it's tongue-in-cheek, they're just joking, whatnot. But then last year, Pope Francis comes out as the first pope to ever mention baptizing an extraterrestrial. And now that one of the leading astronomers of the VORG, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, Guy Consolmagno, is going on a speaking tour to most major universities. The title of his talk, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? Along with a book of the same title. So they're really pushing this idea into the culture that not only do they exist, but apparently they are eligible for baptism.
Now, why are they doing this? I mean, through science fiction movies, the pop culture has been getting this idea that we may be visited at some point. You know, you begin with the UFO phenomenon in the late 1940s, and spawned a whole series of science fiction movies. I know our friend Gary Stearman has talked about The Day the Earth Stood Still, and the profound impact it had on him and his career, his studies. Why is the Vatican now, at this point in history, being so proactive in addressing the possibility of alien contact?
Well, first of all, just on the surface, they had a lot to apologize about the way they treated some scientists through history who made discoveries, and and so what was it? Some years ago, they published a paper in which they apologized for some of the stuff they had said about Galileo and just things like that. So I think they've been trying to kind of change their persona in the public and make it appear as if they're certainly, more scientific. They're up to date. They're not anti-scientific. So I think there's some of that. Mm-hmm. But I also think that if you go all the way back to what Malachi Martin said about why they're up on that mountain studying deep space, Art Bell asked him that in 1997, and his answer was way more cryptic. It actually implied that they were aware of something that they weren't making public knowledge, in that he said they know what is approaching the earth and that it will be of the utmost importance in coming years. And he put about a 10-year time frame on that, and almost 10 years to the date, the Vatican calls for an astrobiology study week at the Vatican. They invite astronomers from all over the world. But what was the question they were asking at that study week? It was, what would the impact be given official disclosure or the discovery of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence? What would the impact on faith be, on religion be? And 90 days later, of course, then you had the oldest scientific body in the world, the Royal Academy, coming together in Britain, essentially asking the same questions. And it was actually on the heels of those two meetings that the media was asking, why is the Vatican talking about this? And that's when Jose Funes came out and said, we'll baptize an alien. Now, there's some very interesting stuff that Chris Putnam did a great deal of research into, and it's in the second book, Exo Vaticana, which we wrote after we came down off the top of Mount Graham, that investigates what Funes was saying, what some of these other guys were saying. But you notice that there's been a change. In other words, they started saying, I would baptize an alien. These would be our brethren. Then they ramped it up a little bit, and they said, actually, the heresy would be not to believe in life on other planets because it puts limits on God's creative ability. And then they ratcheted it up a little bit more, and they started saying, well, actually, when they come, it's more likely they're going to be baptizing us into their understanding of the gospel instead of us baptizing them, because we know about ourselves that we are fallen, right? And but we don't assume that necessarily about them. And if they're not fallen, then they're closer to God than we are, and they may have a better understanding of and revelation of the gospel. So they're going to be coming here to correct us. And some of their Opus Dei level writers, Father Tanzelaniti, who we quote in our book, talking about how a new source of information impacting the gospel from an extraterrestrial source might be made available in the future, and once it's verified. Now, how in the world do you verify something from outer space as being okay with God? I'm not sure how that works, but I guess maybe they're closer to God than we are in some ways, right? And it's going to require us to change, he said, maybe everything we have ever thought we've known about the gospel. So to answer your question, why are they out there talking about it? It almost feels as if they think they know something that the rest of us do not know. And that could take you to, Monsignor Corrado Balducci before he died, saying the Vatican knows that not only do they know that the aliens exist, but some of them are already here. They're on Earth, and the Vatican's aware of it. And now keep in mind, he was no Johnny-come-lately. He was an exorcist for the church, and actually he was the Vatican's official spokesperson on the subject of UFOs and aliens. And just before he died, he went on Italian television, which you can watch on YouTube channels. He was in a documentary film saying that they're using their embassies around the world, the Vatican is, to gather intelligence on the alien agenda. And then, of course, that might have been an oops moment because he got sick right after that and died. But so they almost operate as if they think they know something, And maybe they're moving towards a moment in time, official disclosure, right? A moment in time when they're going to make the rest of the world aware of it. Now, before we get off track, though, about how we got on this book, On the Path of the Immortals, we did go to Mount Graham. Chris and I did. Joe Artis went as our cameraman. He was up there, and people can see film of us on YouTube going up and down all these elevators. We did meet with the Vatican's astronomer at VAT. We clumb all over that. We went to the radio telescope, and then the large binocular telescope that's up on the top of that mountain. That's where the Lucifer device is at, right? Which the Vatican, of course, also has access to using.
Right.
But it wasn't until we came off the mountain that we then really understood something that had happened. And that was why the Apache in particular, but other indigenous peoples, had joined environmentalists in Arizona to file a lawsuit in federal court to try to keep the Vatican and NASA from building an observatory on that mountain. Takes it back to your opening comment. Is there a mountain in southeastern Arizona that is a portal? Well, we found out that that's exactly what they believe.
And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, we'd like to give you a little taste of what Tom Horn and Chris Putnam found when they went back to the mountain. On the Path of the Immortals is the forthcoming book. Watch this.
Now we're on our way to the petroglyphs. There are some strange images that are there.
Yeah. I saw it with the naked eye. Yeah. Did you see it? The orb. I saw an orb with the naked eye. What is that?
In 2012, they shocked the world when they predicted Pope Benedict's resignation 1 year in advance. In 2013, they uncovered the mysteries of Mount Graham, the Lucifer device, and the Vatican's secret plan for the arrival of an alien savior. For the last 24 months, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam have been working behind the scenes on their most guarded project and greatest discovery yet. Mount Graham in Arizona is said to be a portal, and the Jesuits admit they are monitoring something there that is approaching the Earth. But as the Vatican knows and the authors just uncovered, this mountain is not the only gateway to another dimension. Now, in their new book, On the Path of the Immortals, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam set out with cameras and field investigators to document the most astonishing evidence of those behind the veil. Armed with inside intelligence from the native peoples, they unearth chilling evidence of what the Bible says about sacred locations and the giant beings that await their time from within.
They claimed that they could actually conjure light ships down, UFOs, aliens.
So what would have caused these ancient Pueblo Anasazi Indians to have departed this area with such great haste?
We don't know why they never finished completion of the Sun Temple.
Many of them escaped right through some of these mountains, some of these old Anasazi ruins.
Travel with internationally acclaimed investigative authors of Petrus Romanus and Exo Vaticana to learn the truth behind a secret so fantastic that it took 2 years and thousands of miles of research to document what has been kept hidden from the public by elitists and intellectuals who are planning mankind's assimilation under a coming savior.
Here's the six-toed giant our Indian guide told us about. And there's the fallen reptilian with the halo above his head that came through the portal.
One whom the prophet Daniel foresaw as an alien god. On the Path of the Immortals.
What did they find at the top of the mountain? We're talking to Tom Horn and Chris Putnam, co-authors of the forthcoming book On the Path of the Immortals. And we left off with the Vatican and its observatory on the top of Mount Graham. And, Chris, the Apache Nation filed a lawsuit to stop the Vatican from building there. Why?
Well, there's a lot of reasons in the press. I mean, one of the things that we made a lot of jokes about was the endangered red squirrel. There's allegedly a red squirrel that lives up there on Mount Graham that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Apparently, they spent $70,000 for rope bridges so the squirrels don't get run over as you go up the mountain. It gets to be a little ridiculous, but it's called a sky island ecosystem, that mountain, okay? Meaning you have nothing but desert, scrub brush, cactus, that kind of thing. But as you go up that mountain, it becomes like a plush forest. It's just amazing, the difference. So it's a completely different environment the higher you go. But when you get up there, it's like a different world. It really is. And so the idea that these Native Americans thought this was a sacred site, it's not a stretch at all, because it's just completely different from the rest of the area. And when we got back, Tom got some emails with photos of people who had taken pictures of strange entities that seemed to be coming through this portal on top of Mount Graham.
Well, and we found out that Mount Graham is one of 4 of the most holiest mountains in the world for all American indigenous people. So you have to wonder why the Vatican and NASA would be willing to fight in federal court to build on the top of one of the holiest mountains when there's a lot of other mountains. And I'm sure they could have found the same kind of environmental circumstances and elevation and whatever on some other mountain. Why did they want that one in particular? And the conspiracy red light went off in my head when we were contacted after we got down off of the mountain, and we were told that the main reason they didn't want them up there is because Mount Graham is, for the indigenous people, what we would call in our tongue a stargate. It's a portal. It's a sacred location. There's actually she's a Mayan, I believe, and she is a professor that just put out a book on sky people, and we've been corresponding a little bit with her, and she's very much aware of Mount Graham as a place where the sky people have been moving in and out of our reality since the beginning of time. Well, when we found that out, that was when the light went on. It was like, wait a minute, maybe there's an idea here that is so esoteric, so kind of beyond anything that we had been thinking about up until that point in time, that it puts a whole new spin about why that mountain in particular had to be the one that the Vatican, who obviously also has an interest in mystical things, right? That had to be the place they were going to go.
And also, in Ex Vaticana, you'll find out that there are laws about, building on protected wilderness sites. The U.S. Forestry Service has all kinds of regulations, and you have to go through Congress. You have to go through a process. Well, apparently, the Vatican didn't have to do that. Now, it's really suspicious. Now, I don't have any direct evidence of this, but 6 months after the Pope visited Arizona, Senator John McCain bypassed Congress, bypassed the Forestry Service, and got a special permit to build that observatory with no voting, no oversight.
And reportedly had a very confrontational meeting with a couple of naturalists who were concerned about the impact. And confrontational is a nice way to put it.
Well, and so the thing was, we were ready, though. Our book was heading for the typesetter. It was through editing. I mean, we were finishing up. We didn't have time to do anything more than drop just a few hints in the book Ex Vaticana about what we had just learned. And so since Ex Vaticana came out, the last 2 years, we picked up the research again. We wanted to find out more about what the indigenous people believe, the Apache. It took us back to the ancient Anasazi Indians and what happened to them, and why did these well, first of all, why were they even building dwellings on the side of sheer cliffs? Right, what were they trying to, protect themselves from? One thing led to the other, and as the shows that we're doing go on, people will learn that Chris just got back from a trip with a crew to Sedona, which is kind of the southern tip of the ancient Anasazi dwelling places, while I went to the Four Corners with a different film crew, and some of the stuff that we found was just extraordinary. This rabbit hole just kind of kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and then, of course, what he can tell about is things we didn't expect. We didn't think we'd go where they tell us the portals are and then actually film things that come through portals, but it appears that did happen and that we caught film of it.
Well, yeah, Chris, talk about that. You went from being a disbeliever in the phenomenon of capturing orbs on film, and that those orbs may have some supernatural significance. What is it that changed your mind?
Well, in the process of researching my book, The Supernatural Worldview, I studied at the Ryan Research Center which is what's left of the Duke Parapsychology Lab in Durham, North Carolina. And one of the guys I studied with, he says, he gets all these photographs of orbs, the people say are ghosts, and 90% of them are just dust or camera anomalies, light reflecting inside of a camera, things like that. So that's pretty much what I thought they were. And then I read about the Bradshaw Ranch right outside of Sedona, which is a famous area known to be a portal. There's several books about that available. So I read those books, and so I said, we're going to go there and check this out. Didn't really expect to see any orbs, but, I thought I would check it out. So the way to verify it's not a camera anomaly is to use multiple cameras.
Right.
Okay, so we had a video camera and real high quality Canon cameras, not cheap cameras, on tripods, so there's no movement, with flash, without flash, with a professional photographer. And we caught orbs flying around without flash on video and still photography at the same time. And didn't expect that at all. And it really did change my mind.
And I watched part of this film, and to me it's strange in that it's almost as if it's alert that you're there. It flies down. It's doing acrobatics above your head, and then it literally goes.
It just kind of fades in and out.
And it just like mist just going apart, and getting it from 2 camera angles was what really impressed me, and I was glad they set it up that way. So what is it is a different kind of a question, but the fact that these locations, Chris got some, they call them geomagnetic maps, and some of the stuff that you had studied before you went there that was talking about these different I'll let you explain it.
Well, John Keel is one of the early, writers about paranormal phenomena. And he wrote Operation Trojan Horse about UFOs, possibly.
The Mothman Prophecies was based on his work, right?
And so John Keel's somebody I studied because he's a critical thinker. He believes in this stuff, but he's not just gullible, right? And one of the things that he had written about, he called them windows instead of portals, but he believed that in every state there were several of these windows that allowed these UFOs and entities to come and go. And he associated it with areas of high magnetic anomaly. And so you can get from the government the geographical map of magnetic anomalies. Well, if you look at it, Sedona, Arizona is probably the most, like on the color scale, it's pink. In our book, it's black and white, so it's not quite as clear, but it was so pink it went off the chart. Right there in Sedona, right where we were. So it really is a magnetic anomaly area.
So that you have a certain level of kind of scientific evidence that something is different about this area, as it might be compared to other areas. And yet this goes all the way back into early American Indian history, where they didn't have the kind of tools you would need to monitor magnetic differences in the earth.
And with just a few minutes left, and I think this will probably set up our discussion for our next program, Tom, tell us a little bit about what you learned about the beliefs of the ancient Native Americans from that area, their creation legend, and what they believe may have come through back in the day.
Well, first of all, Mount Graham in Arizona, you can read the Apache creation myth yourself online, and they talk about how in the time before time, the Creator came down. Now, their story is interesting, and ufologists love it, because they say a giant silvery disc came down over the mountain, right? And in it, they said, set a bearded man. That was the Creator. And they say he began creating all that there was, and he's good, and he's creating all these good things on the earth. Not long after, the portal opens again, and they say another man comes through it, but they say this wasn't really a man. They say he was a dragon. He was a fallen seraphim. He was a reptilian with a halo around his head, is how they depict him in the petroglyphs that we filmed, right? He comes through and he begins deceiving all of the world. Then right after, giants start coming through the portals, giants, and they're flooding out across the Arizona Badlands, right? And they're cannibalizing the Jindupids, the peaceful Indian farmers who run into the clefts of the rocks, and they begin crying out to God to save them, and then God sends a flood that comes over the earth that wipes out all of the giants. So the amazing part about this that we also found redundant was you have a consistent storyline that's being interpreted by different people through their own world views, but all the principles are the same. The Creator, the dragon who comes down, the giants. Now, there at Mount Graham, they also talk about, after the giants, between then and now, they talk about these owl-like beings. And when they draw them, they look like they're drawing the alien grays. And they say they're coming in and through those portals, and their medicine men say these are bad medicine to totally be avoided. In fact, where you were at the Superstitious Mountains, that's why they're named that, because that whole area through there was kind of a place where sometimes it was plagued, if you will, with these owl-like people who would come through there, who were to be avoided. But yeah, we found that kind of consistency, and in the next show I can maybe mention what we found when we went into the Four Corners area with a film crew, actually met with the third generation, the Navajo Nation's medicine man, and some of the stuff he told us was very eye-opening.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the concept of portals and how we can reconcile this with what we know from Scripture, and whether this is a biblical concept. We'd like to make you aware and make this available to you. Actually, the research that Tom and Chris did for the book On the Path of the Immortals, call the number on your screen or visit skywatchtv.com for the special On the Path of the Immortals package. Not only will you get this book, but you get the 2 previous books in the series, which would be Exo Vaticana and Petros Hermanus, The Final Pope is Here. In addition to that, we will add a book that is a great primer, a conservative theological view of the possibility of life in outer space, life in other worlds. The book, What Dwells Beyond by Jeffrey Martis, again, conservative theologically, but very out of the box in terms of its thinking. In addition to the 4 books, 2 DVDs, The Secret Vatican and Alien Antichrist Connection, and the Special Investigative Report for On the Path of the Immortals, all of that together over a $120 value for just $39.95. Again, available through the telephone number on your screen or at skywatchtv.com. Gentlemen, just about a minute or so left, actually less than a minute. If you had to pick one thing, Chris, I'll throw this to you. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered during the research for the book?
Well, Derek, I would have to say it is the UFO photo that we ended up with. And, it's online now, and people are probably aware of it, but it's a triangle UFO. I don't know what it is. UFO means unidentified, but we didn't even see it. It flew over so quietly that my wife got it by accident. We got home, we're reviewing the photos, and it's just huge triangular craft. It looks like way up in the distance. And so that was just kind of shocking.
We have had it analyzed, so we'll talk about that.
Yeah. With more on the next program. Who are the Immortals and what are they waiting for? For Skywatch TV, I'm Derek Gilbert.